Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you enjoyed lunch. And I know some of you were in here during Dr. Collins' presentation, so this is definitely a natural progression. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Tia Schultz, and we both work in the special ed department here at UW-Whitewater. She is definitely a coworker and friend. Her research focuses on social, emotional, and behavioral skills. She worked in the area of autism, really focus on challenging behaviors. And one thing I like about Dr. Schultz is behavior is a part of her, like every part of her life. When I have conversations with Dr. Schultz, I get tips on my own children. She's helped me with my own son. And so it's definitely a part of who she is. Okay, and so she is a great asset to our department and our students. So welcome, Dr. Schultz.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Oz, and thanks for having me here today. I have a couple of handouts that Dr. Oz will be passing out. One is of the PowerPoint, and then there's an additional sheet that's a worksheet we'll talk about when we get to it in the slides. And so I made a larger copy, so you could have that as well. So she already introduced me, so I don't need to say anything else about myself. I'm wondering how many of you in the audience have been or are my online students or my advisees who I don't see face to face. See a few of you. Nice to see you in person. So some of you have heard a little bit of this before, but my plan today is to really talk about Tier 3 and go through the FBA and the BIP process, paying particular attention to places where we might struggle when we're going through that process with some tips. And then I'll share some resources at the end as well. So Dr. Collins talked before lunch and did a nice discussion of Tier 1 and Tier 2 and really gave the foundation of behavior, so I don't need to do that. And what I'm going to do now is talk about Tier 3. And what happens at Tier 3 is a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA, and then the development of a behavior intervention plan, or a BIP. And so I think it makes sense to start by asking the question, how do we know it is time to move to Tier 3? And so some things that might let us know it's time to move to Tier 3 would be if the behavior is harmful, so if the student is hurting themselves or hurting other people, if this behavior is pervasive, so it's been happening for a long time, and there hasn't been a response with the Tier 1 and Tier 2 types of strategies or interventions. Or if the behavior seems particularly complex, that might warrant doing an FBA and developing a BIP. And if you have a classroom of students and they don't all have EBD, for example, so you have a mix of students, if you have a large percentage who seem to need an FBA, then really we need to go back and revisit Tier 1 and Tier 2 to see what we can be doing to support students. We shouldn't need to do an FBA for all of our students. It should really be for the ones who have the most complex or aggressive or pervasive behaviors. That being said, everything we'll talk about for the FBA process and the BIP process could be used at Tier 1 and 2 in a more truncated version. So it's part of the reason I enjoy talking about this topic, is because it doesn't just apply when you're doing an FBA and a BIP. You could be doing some of these things without doing a full-blown FBA at earlier tiers. Because if the behavior is less complex, we don't need to do the whole FBA, but we can use the components of an FBA to make sure we're matching our interventions. And so just to reiterate, for most of you, I think you've heard this before, and Dr. Collins talked about it as well, but to sort of give some support to why do we need to do an FBA? Because I think we would like to just often jump to interventions when we see a challenging situation because we want to help right away as soon as we can. But it's important to do an FBA because challenging behavior is determined and supported by what's happening in the environment around that behavior. And so if this behavior has been going on for a long time or hasn't been responding to our other attempts at intervention, then we really do need to do a full-blown FBA to make sure that we're collecting all of the information we need so that we choose the appropriate behavior interventions. All right, so for the first part of what I'll talk about, I'll be going through the steps of a functional behavior assessment and stopping to talk about some areas where we might have a few more challenges when we're going through the process. Places where, in my experience, have been more difficult to do well or to know what to do. And I encourage you, even though we're in a large auditorium, to stop me at any point and ask questions or interject. That's more of my style for those of you who've been in my face-to-face classrooms. So feel free to stop me at any point. The lighting here is kind of blinding, so I may not see you well. So you may have to also call out when you raise your hand because I can't see you. But don't be afraid to interrupt. Okay, so it's time to do an FBA. We're going to collect a lot of data. But just as importantly as collecting the data, we need to know what to do with it. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about as well today. I think, in general, as educators, we do an okay job of collecting the data, right? We've got data everywhere, assessments and observations and records and all of the stuff. But it's what we do with it that's really important. And so if we were to boil down the FBA into the most important steps of what we need to do to have a solid FBA, this is what I would say. So first of all, we need to define that challenging behavior because that's going to determine how we measure it. It's going to determine a lot of things we do from that point on. So we need to know what we're looking at. And then we'll collect some informal data, and this would include interviews and reviewing records of the student as well. And then the third part, which I unfortunately don't always see when I'm out consulting, is collecting some observational data. So it can be time-consuming. It is time-consuming, and it can be tough to collect good observational data, but it is necessary. It is not an FBA if we only have the informal data. We cannot do a functional behavior assessment based on interviews and record reviews. We need to observe the behavior. So it's really a necessary part of having an actual FBA. So some key things to keep in mind when we're defining a behavior. These are some of the most common mistakes. That's why I sort of mentioned them here. Is first of all, we need to make sure that we're defining different behaviors separately. So sometimes we want to throw them all in together in one definition. So maybe the student is yelling out, and maybe the student also throws their school supplies around, and maybe the student also refuses to complete work. Those are all separate behaviors, so we need to make sure we're giving them each their own definition when we define them. And then we need to make sure that the way we define them are measurable and observable. So we need to be writing down what the behavior looks like. And I mentioned related to this, it's not the same as a goal. So we get used to writing goals and objectives for students, IEP goals. So sometimes when people write behavior definitions, they want to write them in that format with the 4 out of 5 times or in all these different environments and who they're with and things like that. That's not needed for a behavior definition. A behavior definition is stating what it looks like so we can measure it. So we might say the student hits themselves in the face as defined by when their hand makes contact with their head forcefully, something like that. So we're just specifically talking about what that looks like when the student is hitting themselves in the head. And even the word forcefully, we need to be careful because we could say, well, what does that mean? When is it forceful? When is it not? And if the student is never touches themselves in a gentle way, then we might just say anytime they make contact, that's going to count. But if the student also has maybe some nervous behavior and they make contact in a way that's not self-injurious, then we need to make a determination of when is it one and when is it the other. And so the same thing with being off task, with being maybe with speaking out during class, with interrupting. We need to talk about what that looks like. And so you need to imagine when you write your definition, now if I were to hand this to someone else, would they record the same things that I'm recording? And so I always go back to what does it look like? And that's what we want to write about, what it looks like. Any questions about defining the behavior? Okay. Okay, so then once we have a behavior definition, we can start to collect more information, and we can do this informally in the beginning. And it may actually lead to us revising our behavior definition, tweaking it, adding to it, revising it, things like that. And so some of the questions we want to answer during our informal data collection period is thinking about and finding out how long has this behavior been going on? Which environments does it happen in? With whom does it happen? What happens before the behavior? What happens after the behavior? And then also, we want to know about interventions that have been tried before, and did they work or not work, and try to figure out maybe why. And also, we want to know what kind of skills does the student have related to this area, or what kind of skills might they be missing. And so if the student is exhibiting challenging behavior and it's only in a math class, then I'm going to want to know, well, what do their math skills look like? Is math really challenging for them? Or sometimes, in some instances, is math really easy for them? And so we want to see what kind of skills might need remediation. And so we can look at old records. So sometimes we'll get some of this information from the student's file, from the IEP, from other attempts at FBA reports. And then we want to also interview the relevant adults that work with the individual. And so this could be the parent. Parents always have really great information. And whatever teachers or staff are working with the student when the challenging behavior is occurring. And so we'll do our best to interview all of those people and find out what they're seeing and what their experiences are. One thing to keep in mind when we're interviewing is that most people aren't trained to give you an operational definition and to give you the pieces you need to determine a function of a behavior, and so you need to think about how you ask your questions to help get that information. So if they're not going to naturally tell you what it is you're needing, then you need to think of ways that you can phrase it and ask and follow up that can get at that information. The other piece of this, too, is to remember that people are going to give you their perceptions. And that's important to note, not because their perceptions are unimportant or inaccurate, but because their perceptions aren't the same as what you might observe if you observed. And so we do want to know what people's perceptions are because it tells us a lot about what's happening in that interaction, but also remembering that it might look different or feel different to other people and then also to you when you observe. And this is part of the reason why it's so necessary for us to observe as well, because we need to get all of that information. And hopefully by the time we're done interviewing and reviewing records, we have an idea about the environments in which the challenging behavior occurs and a good idea of an operational definition. Because at this point, we're going to go in to observe, and we need to know what we're looking for. Any questions about informal data collection before I move to direct observation? Okay. And so then I put this funny cartoon up, or at least I think it's funny, but I'm a behaviorist, so I understand that my humor might be a little bit different. But it says, it's all fun and games until someone figures out the function of your behavior. And so when we do our direct observation, we're going to be doing two things, which I'll be talking about. But we need to figure out the function, and then we also need a baseline of the challenging behavior, because we need to be able to compare our intervention time to the time when there was no intervention, just so we know if it's working. And so during this direct observation, one of the things we'll do is what we call an ABC assessment, or an antecedent behavior consequence assessment. How many of you have experience doing some version of this, even if it was informally, trying to take notes, watching a student figure out what the function might be? And so when we do an ABC assessment, as you know, we're going to record every time we see the behavior and what happens right before and right after. And the key to doing this is to look for patterns. And so we're going to keep doing it until we see some patterns in our data. So people always ask, how long should I collect ABC assessment data? Well, it really depends. It could be for a really long time if the behavior is so complex we can't figure out the pattern right away. It could also be possible to do an ABC assessment in, dare I say, one observation. I mean, it's good to do a follow-up to get more information, but you will anyway for your baseline. But you might have a good idea of the function after one good solid observation period. And then we're going to be focusing on two functions. So when I talk today, everything is going to fall into one of two buckets: positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. Everything else is details. So I'll talk about that more in the future. But the first thing we need to do is only one of those two categories, and that really simplifies things for us as well. And so this is what I just talked about, where we start to develop a hypothesis about the function once we can see some patterns in the ABC data. This chart is one way to think about functions for those of you who are more visual. So we have our problem behavior on top, and then we have, we can either obtain or get something, which is positive reinforcement, or we can escape or avoid something, which is negative reinforcement. And then under those two big buckets, it could be social, it could be a tangible item, like something you can hold, it could be an activity, it could be sensory. So there are a variety of different things that fall in those buckets, but in general, we're trying to determine, is the student trying to get more of or access to one of those things, or to escape or avoid one of those things? These bullet points up here I put next based on my experiences working with other people and supporting them in doing functional behavior assessments, because they come up pretty frequently. And one of them is that people often will say, well, it seems like there are two functions to this behavior. They're gaining something and they're escaping something. It's pretty rare that there are two functions that are the primary function. I have a note on the bottom that if there are two functions, often one of them is primary, but we should go in assuming that there's one, or one main one. If it seems like there are two, that means we have to do some more detective work to figure out which one it really is. And most often this comes up in situations where a student might engage in a challenging behavior, and then the teacher or adult or parent might engage with the student to say you shouldn't be doing that or whatever, maybe getting a back and forth. And while that is happening, the student is also not having to complete whatever task they had been working on or supposed to be working on, right? So it seems like really confusing. It could be attention or it could be escaping that task. And so we need to do a little work, if that's the situation that we're seeing, to figure out which one it is. And some things we can do, first of all, we can see if there are, if the behaviors are happening in two different environments. It could have different functions in those different environments, so that might help us narrow things down a bit. We also can think about what is happening before the behavior as well. So for instance, if the student was getting a lot of attention before and then engaged in the challenging behavior, and we can't decide if it's attention or escape after, we might lean toward escape, toward negative reinforcement, because they already had a lot of attention before. So it doesn't seem like it would be as powerful after. And so those are the types of things we can do to think about what the function could be when it seems like there are two. What else is happening in the environment? What else does a student find reinforcing in other situations? And that can help us sort of put weight on one side or the other to narrow that down. Trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about that. The other thing I sometimes see is if it seems like there are two functions, we've actually lumped two behaviors together. It seemed like they went together, but it's really, they can be separated. And they're two behaviors, and they have two different functions. They just happen really close in time. And so sometimes we can pull those things apart as well. So maybe the student calls out, and then it brings the teacher in to have an ongoing conversation. Then maybe it escalates very quickly, and the student maybe throws something off their desk, and then is sent out of the room and doesn't have to finish what they're doing. So the first behavior might be for the attention. The second one might be for escape. So sometimes if we look at our behavior, we can pull apart two different behaviors, and that will help us figure out function as well. Another thing that I noted in here to remember is that behaviors have different functions for different students, even if it's the same behavior. And I think that sounds obvious, but sometimes we'll get really busy and bogged down with things, and we'll just think, I have this one intervention I always do for students that engage in this one particular behavior. But there could be different functions for different students, even if the behavior looks exactly the same. So we need to remember that, and that's part of the reason we have the FBA process. And also, a student could have 2 or more behaviors that have the same function. So the converse of what I said earlier, where there might be 2 behaviors that are linked together but have different functions. The student could also have 2 separate behaviors, and they could have the same function as well. So that's why it's really important to get really good ABC data and write all of this down to look for those patterns, because then we start to see what our actual behaviors are and what functions go with them. Any questions so far about functions? Okay, so I usually recommend that people first take ABC data, get a sense of what's happening, because when you're doing your ABC assessment, you still have time to pull those behaviors apart or put them together or edit your definition, and it's not going to really affect your ABC data, right? You have that all written down. You can go back and look at it. You can analyze it and organize it any way you want. But once you get to the dimensional data, where you're actually counting or timing how long the behavior lasts, we need to have a solid operational definition. And so I think it can be helpful to do the ABC assessment first and then collect our baseline data. That being said, and knowing that we don't always have as much time as we'd want, it is possible and it is okay to do those at the same time. But if you're new to collecting this type of data, it's nice to separate them, and as you get more practice, then we get better at being able to do ABC data and baseline data at the same time. But if you're still in the phase where you do a lot of revising and pulling apart and getting help in that beginning process, then it's good to hold off with your dimensional data for a little bit. And so when I talk about dimensional data here, I'm talking about a frequency count, so how often does the behavior occur, or how long does it last, or we could measure latency, which is that gap between when we give a direction and when the behavior finally occurs, if ever, right? And so we can time that, and we could target that as well. And after we collect that data, it's really important to convert it to a way that we can compare our data to each other. So I'll talk about how to convert the data as well to rates or percentages. And then putting them in a line graph help us visually see what's happening. So frequency count is a good way to measure behavior if the behavior has a clear beginning and an end. So like we know it's happening and we know it's ending. So the student tosses something on the floor, we can count that. 1. They toss something else on the floor, 2. That's pretty easy. The example up here, like Ryan slammed his book 14 times, we just count it. 14 is the frequency for that observation. Duration is more helpful if behaviors sort of run together. So an example for this would be what we often refer to with younger kids, and maybe older kids sometimes, as quote-unquote tantruming behavior. So maybe there's yelling, maybe like throwing themselves on the floor, maybe some hitting, kicking, grabbing at things, but it's all happening sort of together, and it wouldn't be very meaningful to say they grabbed twice, they yelled 3 times, right? Like that gets cumbersome and isn't very meaningful. So we might say that that behavior occurred for a minute and a half or 10 minutes or however long it happened. We could time it. We could also do this for other types of behavior. The example I put up here is maybe a student who gives really long answers in the classroom. So you ask for a response and they share, but they talk for 35 minutes. We could measure that, and we might target decreasing that amount of time. And then latency is typically used with the type of behaviors where students aren't compliant or aren't initially compliant, and so there's a lag time between when you give the directive and when they follow through. We can time that as well. So in this example, the teacher says, get out your pencil, and then the student sits in their seat for a minute and then gets out their pencil. The latency is 1 minute. We would expect it to be, well, maybe not expect it. We would hope it would be shorter, but it's not in this case. And so then we can take those numbers we have and we can convert them. And so when you're doing an FBA, you should have a number, either an amount of time or the frequency, or you could have that latency for each observation period. And so you might go in on Monday, you might go in on Wednesday, you might go in on Friday. Those are 3 different data points. And when it comes to reporting that information and graphing it, it is helpful to convert the data because our observations often aren't the same exact amount of time. So if they were the same exact amount of time, we don't need to convert, but often we come in and our time could vary because maybe we have to leave early one day, or we come in later another day, or the student leaves to go to the restroom and is gone for a while, so our observation times are all different. And so what we can do then is we can convert to a rate or a percent of time, and then we can compare all of those numbers. So if we don't do that, we might observe on the first day for, say we observe for the whole day, which would rarely happen, right? But say the whole day, so we saw 100 instances of blurting out. The next day we observe for 2 hours, and we see 10 instances. Well, it's lower, but also our amount of time was lower. So if we were to try to compare those, we need to have a rate instead, so we can see was it actually higher or lower because it wasn't the same amount of time. And so what's important here is that you record the amount of time you're observing, and then you can just divide the number of times you see the behavior by how long you were observing. And then you would have a rate per minute. And then everything that you observe would be rate per minute on all of your days. Similarly, you can do that with percent. So you could have a percent of time. So if you observe for 30 minutes and the student is engaging in a behavior for 15, then that's 50% of the time observed. So that's pretty easy. The other time we use this is for behaviors mostly related to compliance, because we need to know how many opportunities the student had to be compliant. So if we give a directive and then they don't follow through, and we give a directive and they don't follow through, those are all separate instances. But we have to know how many times they were given a directive. Otherwise, our number is sort of meaningless. We could say they were non-compliant 10 times, but the student gave or the teacher gave 150 directives. Well, that's actually pretty good compliance, right? So we can change that to percent as well. Yeah, that's a great question. So actually the research isn't clear for most behaviors on what amount is good or bad. What we would want to do is look at what does that look like for peers for that student. So in this setting, with either that age range or that developmental level, what are we seeing for other students? And at this point, when we're collecting this data, we've already determined they need an FBA. And so we've decided that whatever is happening is significant, and we're really collecting it now so we can compare this number to what happens after intervention. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Yeah? Okay. It's a good question. The question has also come up before, too, with when we think about praise and reinforcement, like what's the key number that we need to hit with these? And again, we would just go to the context we're in. What does that look like in the settings that we're in with the peers that we're in? Research doesn't tell us a lot about a specific number for many of these things. And that's why we collect the data, and then we can see if our intervention is helping to change that or not. All right, I include this table. It just summarizes what I talked about, helping you decide which one do I use for different types of behavior. It's not really magical. It's sort of common sense. So if you're the type of person that doesn't love numbers and data, if you just kind of step back and just say, what makes sense? They're blurting out. I can count how many times they blurt out. Or they're engaging in this really long behavior. Well, maybe I should just time that. So I would say not to overthink it, but think about what makes sense. And then think about if I were to change something, what would I want to change? Would I want it to happen less often? Or would I want it to not last as long? And so, for example, if a student is getting out of their seat and leaving the classroom, so if they leave once a day but leave for 30 minutes, then we're probably more interested in that length of time. If they leave for 15 seconds but they get up 30 times during the class, then we're probably more interested in the amount of time rather than getting them back quicker, right? So just kind of stepping away from the numbers if you don't like the numbers, if it starts to feel like making you anxious, then just kind of think about what would make sense and then come back and say, okay, this is how I'll collect my data. Okay, and so this part I'm going to talk about just kind of quickly, just to point out that there are different ways to do this. So you can do continuous data collection, and that means that you would pick a period of time and you would observe, and record every instance of the behavior, or that whole amount of time the behavior occurs. So this is the easiest way to do it, but is more time consuming. There is a discontinuous method, and so I put it in here because most of us don't have a ton of time, and I want you to know that it's out there, but a lot of times actually can become more complex, and so I usually prefer continuous observation methods when I can do them because I think it's easier. It just takes a little more time. But with discontinuous, we can do interval recording. And so how many of you have done interval recording before? I find that usually people in school settings have done some version of this because you don't have the time to do continuous observation. But that would mean if you're doing one of these methods, you would divide the time into smaller chunks, and then you would just, using one of these methods, decide if the behavior occurred or didn't occur during that chunk of time. So you could keep doing what you're doing in the classroom and then just record it if it falls in one of these categories. So for example, if you're doing whole interval recording, you would, if the behavior occurred for that whole interval that you've chosen, then it would be like a check. Like it happened during that whole interval. You could do partial, where if it occurred at any point during the interval, you check it off. So once you see it, you check it, and you don't worry until the next time interval starts. And then once you see it, you check it off and wait for the next interval to start. And then with momentary time sampling, it would just be if it's happening at the end of the interval. So like if you had a 2-minute interval, you would look up at 2 minutes. Is the student on their cell phone? Yep, check. And then keep doing your stuff. Timer goes off, 2 minutes. Are they on their cell phone? Yep, check. And it counts. So it's a method for saving time. Once you get good at it, it saves time. But like I mentioned, setting it up can be sometimes a little bit harder. And so sometimes the continuous method is easier. And then I just threw in an example of a graph. And this was actually done by one of my students in class that gave permission to share it a while back. It's pretty old now. But the idea here is that we want to do a line graph when we do our baseline data, because then we can compare it to our intervention period of time. And so along the bottom axis, we're going to have the days or the sessions that we observed. And then along the vertical axis, we're going to have either the rate per minute or the percent of time or the percent of opportunities. And there's just one data point for each observation session. We turn it into a line graph, and then we get a feel for what does this look like during baseline. And then we'll add to the same graph after we do intervention. And then you'll be able to see much more clearly if your intervention is working or not. Okay, any questions about the FBA process? Okay, so this is typically the part that we don't enjoy as much. There's a lot of data. It's not as fun for those of us who had our training because we wanted to do intervention. And so then the next part of what I'm going to talk about is how we put together a nice, tight behavior intervention plan using what we learned in the functional behavior assessment. Okay, so just like with the FBA, you could boil it down to a couple of main things that you need to make sure are in it. We need to do the same thing. We could do the same thing with a behavior intervention plan. So you need to have a goal. We need to have a goal because that's going to help us know what we're working toward, right? So that's pretty obvious. And then we want to have 3 things. It wants to shut us down. We're saying no thanks. And then there should be 3 main parts to our behavior plan. So a good, comprehensive BIP is going to have an area where we are talking about teaching new skills to our student, where we are addressing antecedent-based, where we have antecedent-based strategies in place. so that we can prevent the challenging behavior and promote the replacement behaviors that we want to see. And then we need to also alter the consequences. So if we think about that ABC, we need to be working on both ends of the ABC, both sides of the behavior, and we also want to teach new skills. And that's what I'm going to go through now. Okay, so when we write a goal, we can write a goal in the form of an IEP goal. That's totally fine. And then we might have some benchmarks that might identify replacement behaviors. So if we think about replacement behaviors, this is when we start to think about, okay, we know what we don't want the student to do, but what is it we do want them to do? And this is often a tougher question because sometimes we're not sure. We just want them to stop doing that thing that is disrupting our class or that's being harmful to others. Might be at this point, sort of irritating people. We're getting worn down. We just want it to stop. So we need to think about what do we want them to do instead. And we need to choose some replacement behaviors. And these can be benchmarks for an IEP goal. It can be embedded in the IEP. We could have them in addition to an IEP goal. And some things to think about are to find a replacement behavior that meets the same function. So when we do an FBA, we determine the function of the challenging behavior. And the problem is not that the student needs that function met, right? It's okay to need attention. It's okay to need a break. What's not okay is to hurt other people to get to that, right? And so we need to think about what could they do instead that would help them get what they need, because their behavior was communicating to us, and it was helping them get what they needed, and that need is still there. So we're going to find other things. And so the cartoon here is, so let me get this straight. I don't have to cry and yell to get my cookie. So an example here, a replacement behavior, that guy looks kind of young, but a replacement behavior could be to ask for the cookie, right? It's not a problem that you want a cookie. It's a problem that you're yelling and screaming, and that's disrupting others, and it doesn't, not everyone knows what you need, so it's not very efficient, though effective. And so we want to find replacement behaviors that are functionally equivalent. We want to make sure that our replacement behaviors are efficient, and that means that whatever we come up with needs to be just as easy for our student to do and will result in what they need just as quickly as the original behavior. So if I yell and scream and people run over and give me lots of cookies and I say, no, you need to do this other thing. I'd like you to write me a letter about how you want a cookie and then bring it up to my desk, and then at the end of class I will give you a cookie. That's not efficient. No one's going to do that. Like, I could just yell and scream and people will throw the cookies at me. So that's what we need to think about when we come up with replacement behaviors for our students. And we need to think about it in terms of our student. What is going to be efficient and easy for them to do? It might seem like not a big deal to us. Yeah, you just fill out this form and turn it in. I'll get you that cookie at the end of class. But for our student, it might not be. And then if we are so clever as to come up with a replacement behavior that is incompatible with the challenging behavior, then we really get onto something. And so people who've had me in class before always hear this one example I give, and it's because it's so brilliant, and the reason I can say it's brilliant is because I didn't come up with it, but it's just so perfect for an example. I was on a team with someone who had another team, and so they had to figure out the situation where a student would pull the fire alarm walking from one class to the other. So the student would get in the hallway, and on most days would go pull the fire alarm. And so you can imagine what a big deal this was and how problematic it was. So they had to come up with a behavior plan. Now, I'm sure the behavior plan had more elements, but this one piece will always stick out to me and will continue to be my example for presentations until I see a more brilliant one. But one piece of it involved that the student was given items to bring to the next class to deliver to the teacher. So the student's hands were full in the hallway, then he couldn't pull the fire alarm anymore. He had a job to do, and his hands were full of things, which made it incompatible with also pulling the fire alarm. And like I mentioned, I'm sure their plan had more elements and different pieces to it. But whenever we can think of replacement behaviors like that, it's really helpful because it's helping our student be successful. Now, he can't do that very easily, and we have a chance to reinforce him for doing the thing that we wanted him to be doing. That's more functional, more useful, more helpful, less dangerous. And similarly, so that's replacement behaviors related to our goal, right, and what we want our student to do. And then we'll be thinking about the interventions and what we're doing. And we can do the same thing by thinking about some of those areas. And so for one, we want our interventions to be function-based. So we need to, we're going to have the replacement behavior that meets that function. And then I'm going to talk a bit in a minute about making sure our interventions are aligned with the right function so that we are providing that same type of reinforcement the student was getting before for the new behavior. So I'll talk more about that. Whenever possible, we want to use natural stimuli. So if we can use things that are already in the environment, that can help our student be more successful in other environments as well. So, things like signs, things like verbal directions. There are different types of things our student will encounter over and over. So if those will work, we want to incorporate them. And then we want to think about interventions that could be potentially used class-wide, if this makes sense. So this behavior plan is for one specific student based on their need, but sometimes we can extend what we're doing to the whole class, and that can be very powerful. So my students who go into fieldwork, my undergraduate students, have had a lot of success with this. I probably have, I would say each year, maybe every semester, at least one group who tries doing it this way, and it's pretty cool. So they might have a plan in place, and it's geared at one student so that they maybe receive some maybe additional computer time, or they receive something for engaging the appropriate behavior. But they put it in place for everyone. And it can be really powerful because then it doesn't single out the student in a negative way, and also can help with some of the classroom management, which makes it easier for the student to be successful. So if that ever works, you can consider a class-wide intervention based on what that student in particular that you're writing the BIP for needs. Okay, so then I provided you a copy of this as well because I know it's really small on the PowerPoint. This BIP Planning Worksheet is something I created, and so I use it myself. I use it with my students, and I find it can be a useful tool. If you don't find it useful, don't use it. But if you do, you're welcome to have it. And what I have in here is I've sort of boiled down the main areas that you need to look at to simplify it. And so this doesn't take the place of writing out the BIP. Instead, what this does is sort of outlines it. So the idea here is it helps you make sure you have all of the information for the different areas, and then using that, you could write up your behavior intervention plan. So a good behavior intervention plan would have a lot of detail about who is doing what, when, and where all that is happening, but this could just be bullet points of what strategy are we doing in these different areas to help remind us that we need to hit all of them. And over in the corner, I have function highlighted in yellow because that is going to drive your whole BIP. So if you have negative reinforcement, then you're going to be going in one direction with interventions. If you have positive reinforcement, you'll go in another. And so that's really important. And then on the version I gave you, I added a yellow box on the bottom purple with the goal, because that's also going to drive you. We could have 6 different students have the same challenging behavior and have different goals, right? So maybe the students all of them are off task, and for one student, we just want to increase their in-seat time. Another student, we want to increase work completion. Another student, we want to increase engagement in a particular lesson. So depending on what our goal is, that's going to change our interventions, right? So we need to keep our goal in mind as well. The way that this sheet works is that on the top part, you could just bullet out some of the main points from your FBA. So you would have your behavior in purple, and then some of the antecedents and some of the consequences. And then you would come down here, and based on your challenging behavior, you would say, okay, what is our goal? What are our replacement behaviors? And what kind of skills might we need to teach related to that? And you'd fill in that section. Based on your antecedent pattern, you would say, what are some antecedent-based strategies we could use? So strategies that we are going to put in place before the student engages in any behavior. And we need to have 2 different types. We want strategies that are going to prevent the challenging behavior. So if our student is unsafe with pointy objects, what could we do? Right, yes, we can put the pointy objects up. So that would help them be successful while we work on teaching them some skills, and then slowly giving them more access to tools that they might need. And then, so that's one area. We're preventing the challenging behavior to the extent that we can. And then we want to promote these new behaviors we've outlined in purple. So we want to think about what could we put in place to help our student be more successful. So with the example, maybe they're unsafe with scissors, we put them up so they only have them when they're supervised. And then to promote a goal related to scissor use, then we might have a pictorial that shows how to use a scissor safely. We might have the student always works with an adult, so the adult can be there to help them use them safely. There are some things we can put in place to help them with that goal. So that's the antecedent base. These are things we put in place that happen before we see any behavior. And then the blue section is consequence-based. And these are things we're going to do after we see any behavior. So it could be a challenging behavior or an appropriate behavior. We need to be ready for either. And if we see an appropriate behavior, we want to reinforce based on the function. So if the function was positive reinforcement, we want to positively reinforce the new appropriate behavior. So safe use of scissors in this example. Or if it was negative reinforcement, we're going to use negative reinforcement with the appropriate use of scissors. So maybe they get a break after they use them appropriately. So that part's a little bit easier to think about how we're going to reinforce. Super important because we want to build up that behavior, that new behavior that we want to see. And then we need to think about what will we do when we see the challenging behavior now. And we need to do one thing for sure. We need to the extent that we can, minimize the reinforcement the student gets for that challenging behavior. Ideally, we would remove it completely. That can be tough in school settings where there are a lot of students, and sometimes you have to think about safety, so you might have to intervene in ways, maybe you're giving attention or giving an escape from a task to keep people safe because you have to, but we want to minimize it. We want that to be less reinforcing than the reinforcement we're providing for the appropriate behavior now. And I'll talk more about all of these in a minute. And then this is also where punishment could potentially go. I'm not necessarily advocating punishment, but by definition, punishment is something that decreases a behavior, and there are some natural consequences that by definition are punishment that are not punitive. For example, with the scissor example, if the student is being unsafe with the scissors and then we put them up after the student is unsafe, that could be a punishment. It's not punitive. It's a natural consequence. It might make a lot of sense for that student. So that's where those would go, and I'll talk about that as well. So you can kind of follow along with your worksheet as I go through. I'll be covering the different areas up here. Okay. So this area I feel like often gets overlooked when it comes to behavior intervention plans. We're focused on the antecedents and the consequences, as we should be. That's a really big and important part of this. But we also should be thinking about teaching skills. Most students who are engaging in challenging behavior are doing so because they're missing some skills in other areas. And some of the common areas are often social skills. So there's some skill deficits with their social skills. Emotion regulation. So they might get easily frustrated, might not know what to do with themselves when they feel upset or angry or sad. Some students, when they feel sad, then go to angry behaviors because it feels safer than being vulnerable and sad. So social skills, emotion regulation, executive functioning. So organizing, planning. So those are some really common areas that come up for our students who have challenging behavior. And there's some skills that need to be built up in those areas. And then another area I encourage you not to overlook is the academics. And I mentioned this earlier. If we're seeing a challenging behavior happen in one particular class, for example, we would want to look and see, are there some skills missing in that particular content area? And then in some instances, maybe their skill levels are far above, and they might be getting bored. So we want to also look at that academic piece. They all go hand in hand. But again, we don't want to leave out skill building when we're doing a behavior plan. We're trying to teach our students to be more successful and to have the tools that they need to be successful in lots of environments, and we want to include that in our behavior plan. I talked about this earlier. So for antecedent-based, we want to prevent the challenging behavior as much as we can and then promote the new behaviors, the replacement behaviors. And so some ways we can do this could be by arranging the environment. So we can actually arrange the physical space to help our student be more successful. If they're distracted a lot, we can put them in a place in the room that's less distracting. If they're talking to a friend, you can move them by somebody different. We can have visual aids either in the room or for that student on their desk or their space that might help them remember the order they need to do things, or timers to remind them how long they need to continue on a certain task. Through building relationships. This is how we get to know our students and find out what they like, what they don't like, what they're struggling with. And so if we have a strong relationship with a student, our interventions often work more quickly than if we have either no relationship or a negative relationship with a student, because then we can get in those power struggles. We can provide pre-signals and prompts to help students be successful. So a pre-signal would be something that occurs before we even give the directive, and a prompt happens after. That's the distinction. So the pre-signal, we might say, and remember, in 5 minutes when we switch classes, we'll be going in the hall, and you need to be quiet out in the hall. So we're bringing it up ahead of time before they've had a chance to engage in any hallway behavior. And then a prompt would be, we get in the hall, and we start hearing some noise, and we say, remember, we have to be quiet in the hall. So we've tried to help curb that behavior, but we've already seen it a little bit. The pre-signal happens before, so that we can hopefully prevent it. And you can use them together as well. We can also have pre-signals and prompts that are visual. Sometimes it's appropriate to do it physically. So with some students, it's appropriate maybe to do some hand over hand or to help with something like that. We can give choices ahead of time. And sometimes they might just be 2 choices that we want to happen. We need to make sure that we're okay with the students doing either one. So if we give a choice, we need to honor it. And so you can think about, what could I work in that the student likes that also gets at my goal as well? So, I need to keep everyone in here safe and keep other students on track. So whatever they do needs to work with that. But they like to do computers, or they like to read magazines, or they like to do this certain thing. How can I put those 2 together and give choices? Making sure that we have clear expectations and clear rules is helpful. And this is really a tier 1 type antecedent-based intervention, right? If we have really clear expectations, we have classroom rules, schedules and routines are really helpful for most students. Most students do well with this and need this, but especially students who have challenging behavior, then they need to have a really clear idea of what's about to happen. And if we can routinize things, like we have a routine for things, then students get into patterns where they just engage in those activities in a certain way, and that can be really helpful to us because there's less intervention for us to do. It just becomes a habit. Distraction and redirection. I think distraction is one of those tools that we forget about. I think when we use it, we're like, oh, this works so well sometimes, and then we kind of forget about it. So a distraction, if we're going to compare it to redirection, would be like literally changing the subject or bringing it onto something else. So you see the student looking a little bit squirrely, and you just talk about something totally different, or point them to another activity that's completely different, and get them on to something else to distract them from what appeared was about to happen. And then redirecting might be reminding them about something. Maybe they're working towards something, or they're excited about something, so it could be a reminder. Like, remember, if you get all of this done, then you get to go to the computer lab and play that game you really liked, or do that activity you really liked. Any questions about the antecedent-based interventions? Yes? Mm-hmm.
That the student wants. But it happens unpredictably.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't identify exactly what it is that came right before the behavior.
Okay.
The reason there's no pattern.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, what do we do if the trigger is unclear, if it doesn't appear that there's a pattern of something antecedent-based that's triggering the behavior? So what I would say to that, though, is if we're back in the FBA process and we haven't noticed a pattern, that we would keep collecting data. At this point in time, if we are picking interventions, we should know that. So really the question goes back to thinking about when we're doing our FBA, if we're collecting data and we can't quite figure out what it is that's happening, what could we do? And so you mentioned a couple of things, one of them being that it might seem to be control, and for some students it is. And we could put interventions in place that give the student more control, more responsibility. Some students do well with that. It sounds counter a bit because it might be a student who's typically disruptive and you think, gosh, I give them more responsibility. But it's surprising sometimes that students will really rise up because they want to be sort of in charge and in control of what's happening in their day, and they will meet those responsibilities. So often, when it comes to figuring out the trigger, if we're collecting our data really well, we can find it in those patterns, and it's not always necessarily a trigger in terms of one thing happens, but what do those triggers have in common? So there might be several antecedents, but what do they all have in common? And I think you're already sort of getting at that. They might all be related to feeling a loss of power. So, but maybe it looks different each day, or it looks different in different classes, right? It feels like it has nothing in common because it happened this one day when I said this, and another day when this other teacher said this, and another day when their friend that they really liked did this thing. But all of them, what they had in common was maybe a loss of control or a loss of being able to predict what's about to happen. Is that helpful? So look, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah. The other part of the question then is, how do you identify a behavior to work on? I mean, you could say, we want you not to want control.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you identify what your goal is?
Mm-hmm. So then the follow-up question is, how do you define your goal if it seems like it's related to gaining control or wanting control? Is that accurate? So I would say that it's not necessarily a bad thing that they want control, and the goal would be related to having control, to being responsible with that control in appropriate situations, and then accepting the situations where they can't have control. And we would write it in that sort of way, and we'd be working on two things. We'd be working on, okay, when you do have control, though, you have to be a good leader, be kind to others, make sure everyone gets what they need. And then also, there are situations where you're not in control. If the fire alarm goes off, I'm in charge, and you need to do what I say, and then learning how to accept that and follow rules in those situations. And the first step for that for some students might be determining when is it which one. When is it one where I could try to get more control over using my leadership skills, for example, and when is it one where I need to do what's being told to me? Does that help? And we can talk more after, too, if you have more questions. I love problem solving these things. Great. Any other questions about antecedent-based? Okay. So then we move on to our consequence-based strategies. So if we have a really good behavior plan, we are working on teaching our students some new skills, which makes them more likely to be more successful and confident, possibly have higher self-esteem. So these are all good things. And we put some antecedent-based things in place, which will make it less likely that we're going to see the challenging behavior. So that means we should have to react to that challenging behavior less often. So when we think about consequences, we should be doing this less often in relation to the challenging behavior. And then we've hopefully put antecedent-based strategies in place that promote the appropriate behaviors. And so we have a whole bunch of opportunities to reinforce some new appropriate behaviors. So we've kind of tipped the scale. So at this point, then we're thinking about what do we do now when we see different types of behaviors. And what we need to do is minimize the reinforcement to the challenging behavior. And I mentioned earlier that ideally we would stop reinforcing the challenging behavior. So if a challenging behavior results in escape from the classroom, in an ideal scientific world, we would not allow them to leave the room. That being said, I understand safety concerns in a school setting. So instead, what we would do is minimize to the extent that we can. So if we can keep them in the room, we will. If they have to leave the room, they're no longer going to go down to that fun room with their favorite teacher. Now, if they've engaged in the challenging behavior when they leave, they're going to go to this other more boring place. So that's one way to do it. And similarly with attention. So it might be the same thing might happen. If the student is engaging in a challenging behavior that results in attention, but now they're doing something that's harmful, and I feel like I have to intervene, though, to help alleviate the situation, then we would minimize our attention. So if previously we were having an ongoing conversation, and talking a lot and talking it through, we would stop doing all that. We would come in and give the minimal directives that we need to so that they're getting a lot less attention when they engage in that behavior. And then the flip is we need to highly reinforce the appropriate behaviors. So if the student has the function of negative reinforcement, then maybe they get to have a longer break in that fun room or with that favorite teacher when they do the appropriate behavior. And when they do the challenging behavior, it's a shorter break in the boring area. And the same thing with attention. If they engage in the challenging behavior, I will talk to you very briefly because I need to try to diffuse the situation, but not as much as I'm going to talk to you if you do the thing you need to do. And at which point, then maybe I will chat with you about your favorite thing and come over and give you praise or whatever it might be. So we want to think about less reinforcement for the challenging behavior, more for those new behaviors we identified, those replacement behaviors, anything related to the goal. So some ideas, and they're broken up with positive and negative reinforcement because that's really key here. If the function was positive reinforcement, you would use these. And if it's negative reinforcement, you use the negative reinforcement ones. So some of the first things we can think about is whatever was reinforcing the challenging behavior, we could use that same thing to reinforce the new replacement behaviors. So if it was attention, like I just said, we could give some attention. If it was a break or leaving the room, we could give that instead now for the appropriate behavior. So we just flip that. And all of this, I need to add the caveat. Sometimes people get nervous, like, well, I can't always have my student leaving the classroom, every day, or I can't have a 5-minute conversation with them every day because I have other students. That is very true, but think about this in the short term. So these are things you're already doing just when the challenging behavior occurs, so you're going to move them to the appropriate behavior, and then we can fade back. You don't, just because you start out your plan this way does not mean you need to do it forever. You can remove yourself a bit, you can lower the reinforcement or give it less often. We want to make sure that we're giving more reinforcement for the appropriate behavior than for the challenging behavior. So however we can do that, we want to make it very reinforcing to do this new replacement behavior we've identified. There's a lot of words here. Don't get distracted by all the words. I wanted to have them here to show you the different types of differential reinforcement, but the concept here is just what we've been talking about and probably what you already attempt to do or do in classrooms as teachers and as anybody working in a school. And it's just the idea of what we talked about a minute ago, that we want to give more reinforcement to the new things, the new behaviors that we want to see, and less to the ones we don't. And what I like about this as an intervention, it breaks it down so you can think about it in different ways. And that's why there are all these words here, but don't get distracted. But the idea here is that you can choose an alternate behavior, so a specific behavior that you're going to heap reinforcement on, or you can choose other behaviors. So maybe it's anything the student does that's not the challenging behavior. You can reinforce all of those things. So some students have a really challenging behavior. We might do differential reinforcement of other behavior, meaning that we see anything like, great, I like how you came and sat down, that's great. Like, oh, you brought your books today, that's wonderful. We're just finding things to reinforce, to sort of flip around what has been happening in the classroom before that, perhaps, where there was a lot of attention on the challenging behavior. We can identify an incompatible behavior, which I had talked about before, the fire drill example. So if we find something incompatible, we can reinforce that instead. We can reinforce lower levels of a behavior. So this makes a lot of sense for behaviors that are only challenging because they're happening a lot. An example might be answering questions in class or raising their hand. We don't want our students to stop doing that, but if they're answering every single question in class and no one else gets a turn, that's a problem. So we might want that to just have a lower level. And then the flip of that is differential reinforcement of high levels of behavior. So maybe there's a behavior that we want to increase. Maybe it's sharing in class. Maybe they don't share very often, and we're going to reinforce them for sharing more than they did the last time. So some different ways to think about it, and I always, in my mind, have a visual of a scale, and I think about how we're putting more reinforcement on this other new appropriate behavior and less on this challenging behavior we don't want to see anymore. We can use redirection. So if the student is beginning to engage in the challenging behavior, we can remind them. maybe they're working towards something, like, oh, remember, if you get that whole math worksheet done, you will get to have some computer time. Or remember, if you sit in your seat calmly for the whole class period, you get to have this other thing. So reminding them what they're working toward. We can reinforce peers for displaying the appropriate behavior, but we shouldn't do this in a shaming sort of way. Like, we don't want to make it clear that we're reinforcing someone else because we see them doing something inappropriate, but it could just become a verbal sort of prompt for the student. If we're just pointing out other students, like, oh, great, you're sitting really well over there, that's good, looks like you're ready, like it's just part of what we're doing in the classroom. And then if we see our student engaging in that behavior, the one we're targeting, we can give them some praise as well. We could consider group contingencies. I know Dr. Collins talked about this, some different ways of doing this as well. So you might have the whole class earns something if enough students get points, or if there are different ways you can do it. But if you could pool together the points and have a prize for everybody is one way to do it. There is a way to do it where you are trying to single out the target student in a positive way, but you have to be really careful. If the student has a low level of the appropriate behavior you want to see, but is totally capable of doing it, has all of the skills, then you might consider it, but we don't want to set them up for failure. So if they're close to engaging in the behavior a lot, and you set a goal related to that, and then the whole class gets a prize, the student can become a hero. So that can be helpful in some situations, but you have to be careful because we don't want the opposite to happen where they don't meet the goal and then the whole class feels like they lost the prize. So you can read up on that. There are different ways to do the group contingencies. This is just a chart. It comes from the Smith and Yell book that talks about different ideas of things that might be positively reinforcing for students if you're looking for things. So again, I would say first look at what was reinforcing that challenging behavior and start there. And then you can think of some other ideas here. So for some students, it could be being a helper. Some it could be extra time with peers. Could be access to electronics, an extra minute or two of recess. And I would say don't underestimate small things that don't seem very elaborate. I think sometimes we get nervous thinking, oh, I can't buy all this expensive stuff, or I can't allow them to have an extra 30 minutes at recess. I've worked with a lot of students, students people thought were really tough, even older students, like secondary, young adult age, who would work for stickers and things you wouldn't think anyone would care about. But it became meaningful because of the way the intervention was put in place. So getting a minute, getting a point, getting some of these small things that don't cost anything can be very powerful. Okay, and then negative reinforcement. This is another attempt at behaviorist humor here. But it says every time you confuse negative reinforcement with punishment, a unicorn dies. So this is one of my pet peeves. Negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment, which is probably clear to everyone in this room because most of you I know went to Dr. Collins's and already work in the area of behavior. But we're talking about negative reinforcement here. So are there some things the student finds aversive that we could remove or reduce for them if they engage in the appropriate behavior? So the first question we need to ask if the function was negative reinforcement for our student is escape or avoidance appropriate? And if it is appropriate, then we can teach them behaviors that result in escape or avoidance. So if it's okay for them to not always engage in whatever that activity is, then we can teach them skills for taking a break, asking to postpone it, having a choice about what time of day they do it. We can just teach them to be able to request that and ask for that. Alternatively, there might be some things that the student can't get out of that they have to eventually do. And so then there's some other things we can do to help set them up for success that meets the same function. So we might be able to change the task in some way. Can they meet that same academic goal, for example, through a different activity? Can they do it with a peer? Or if it's a group activity, can they do it alone if that's what they prefer? Can they do it in a different chair? Can they feel like Dr. Seuss now? But can they do it at a table instead? Can they do it on the floor? What can we do to change it up that makes it less aversive for them, that still gets what we need done? If we just need that worksheet done, doesn't matter if they're sitting at their desk quietly. Can they listen to music? Can they do it outside the room? Can they do it on a beanbag? And then we can also alternate tasks too, so we're not just having a whole bunch of tasks that are difficult for our student in a row. We can have a difficult task and then maybe a more preferred task, mix it up a bit. Some of the things here, I think Dr. Collins talked about the pre-MAC principle, which is where you do the thing you don't like to get to the thing you do. So I think many of us as adults do this. If I get that chore done, then I can watch my favorite show, or I can have a glass of wine, or I can eat some candy, or whatever it might be. So we can do it that way, or we can do the opposite with behavioral momentum. So we give the student some things that are easy for them to do. So like, great, like put your books in your desk. Like, okay, they can do that. Great. All right, sit down, get your stuff out. Okay, now do this. And they're building up this momentum of doing these things really well. Then we throw at them one that's a little bit tougher. And sometimes they'll follow that pattern and just get right to it because they've had a bunch of success and reinforcement before that. And we can also work some breaks into a task. So maybe they can't get out of it completely, but we can give them little breaks. Also, we can break the task down into smaller parts. And so a lot of my students in fieldwork have done this with their students, and it can be very successful. Something as simple as cutting the worksheet into strips, so the student's not looking at 10 math problems, they're just looking at 1 at a time or 2 at a time. That can be very helpful. And then we want to reinforce all of those small successes. Like, great, you got a problem done. Maybe they get a 1-minute break, whatever it might be. I'm going a little bit faster because I'm running out of time. Okay, so that has to do, that's all of the negative reinforcement strategies. So those are things we would do when we see the appropriate behavior. They're engaging in the task, or they're doing what we need them to do. We give some breaks. We mix it up a little bit. And then extinction, this is the part where I talked about earlier where we stop reinforcing the challenging behavior. And so if we have attention-seeking behavior, this is where timeout can work if done appropriately. If it's escape or avoidance, timeout does not work, right? It reinforces. So then we would have some form of time in. And then if we have minor attention-seeking behaviors, ignoring goes a long way. It can be tough to get over that hump of the behavior sort of escalating for a bit, but then it really will just phase right out if we can ignore it. So there's a lot to be said for ignoring those minor behaviors. And then I just have to say just a couple things about punishment. I mentioned earlier we want to definitely use it sparingly. It should not be a big part of the plan. We can have a behavior plan without it. We may not have it in at all. But sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, it might make sense to have a punishment in. And that, when I say punishment, I mean it by the scientific definition. I am not advocating for anything punitive. But things like you might lose a privilege. So if you misuse the computer, you don't get to use the computer for a while. You're unsafe with scissors or other items. You don't have access to them for a while. You might have to, if you break something, you might have to help repair it. If you mess something up, you need to help clean it up. Or loss of points as well. So you don't turn something in, you don't get the points. So those would be, could be considered punishments, but aren't particularly punitive. I would consider them, to be fairly natural and make a sense a lot of times, especially for older students who are developmentally at an older place, teaching responsibility. And then we need to continue to collect data. And so we need to think of the behavior plan as a dynamic document that it can change. So we do our best to get everything in there, and then we're going to see things after we put it in place, and then we make changes based on our data. So if our data are showing it's not working, we change it. If our data show it's working really well, we're going to change it too, right? Because we can remove some of those supports. And so this is just an example graph from a textbook, so it's really pretty, but just showing that we can have lines with different phases. So we might have a baseline, an intervention, and in this situation, we're trying to increase the behavior. It goes up, and then in the world of research, we might remove it to see, does it go back down? Does that behavior go back down? In practice, we don't do that because it would be unethical, and we don't want to see our student go back down. But what we might do is take a piece of it out to see, okay, are they ready to do this with fewer supports, and see what the data look like. And so this is why the line graph is so helpful, because you can then manipulate your behavior plan and continue to watch the data to make sure you're helping your student. And then on the last page, I have my email, and I have my card up here too, and I'm happy to stay after and talk. And then I have a couple places you can go for more information. So if you are not familiar with the IRIS modules, they have them in all kinds of areas, but they specifically have a couple modules on behavior that are helpful, that talk about some of the same things I do, and they have data collection forms and different worksheets you can get from there. The CFOL site is a bit more for younger kids. So those of you who work with younger kids and social emotional development, they have some great resources. And then the Affirm modules are specific for students with autism, and they cover the interventions, the evidence-based interventions, and they have modules for most of those interventions. All of these resources are free. So, all right, I think I'm out of time. But thank you all for being here today.